So welcome to the Multi-Species Salon digital version. My name is Evan Kirksey, and I have the great pleasure today of introducing Joanna Radin, who's at Yale University and is going to tell us about the letter R for rot.
Great, thank you. So I'll start with a little introduction. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. You can look it up. It's a famous quote. But this is my interpretation. In the Western intellectual tradition, rot has a negative valence. It's associated with waste, what is no longer capable of being saved. To be rotten can be a material state, a fruit past its prime, a moral state, a disfigurement of the soul, or a social state, a corruption of power. Rotting both activates and offends our senses. It feels slimy. It tastes, at least to a human, like something to be avoided. It reeks of death. The science that studies decomposition is known as taphonomy, which comes from the Greek meaning tomb. Yet, as Astrid Schrader has argued in the case of algal blooms, she says dead zones, which are created by such blooms, aren't actually dead at all. In fact, they're full of life, just not the kind of life we want. Interpreting Bataille, Achille Mbembe has argued, life is only defective when death has taken it hostage. Life itself exists only in bursts and in exchange with death. Death is the putrefaction of life, the stench that is once the source and the repulsive condition of life. And in Hamlet, the decomposition of the king, both physically and politically, is what allows all that is repulsive or rotten to be revealed and reckoned with. In this sense, processes of putrefaction are powerfully generative. They provide epistemologically rich opportunities to conjure multi-species worlds and with them alternate visions for what it means to be alive. In this sense, rot is a way of thinking ontologically in reverse. It can mean understanding the order of things as they disappear rather than as they come into being. Rotting is a process that of necessity requires collectivity, from the vulture to the microbe, the scavengers and decomposers who assemble to help metabolize life after life. What we are wont to identify as nature renews as it does composition. Biotic materials such as excrement or even entrails experience afterlives when recognized as milieu for microbes or other organisms. So in some circumstances, maggot-like fly larvae appear. They are not spontaneously generated, but opportunists par excellence, always close at hand, waiting for their turn on the stage. The role played by such actors in the drama of rot has been made legible in turn through human uses, such as forensic scientists who've been able to calibrate the debut of maggots to the moment between the end of life and the beginning of death. So saying if you can figure out when the maggots showed up, then maybe you have a sense of when the crime was committed, when the death happened. There are also circumstances in which non-human others' ability to decompose is actively cultivated. So here I'm thinking of the dermestid beetle's long-running gig at the Natural History Museum, where nothing has managed to upstage its ability to strip bones of tenacious bits of flesh. And that's why we've got a nice image of those beetles in action. Sniff around and find rot at home in the human sciences as well. Consider anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss's culinary triangle. This menagerie, of which we've got an image, incorporates the category of rotted into his original and better-known binary of the raw and the cooked. Recently, anthropologist Tom Bolstorff has mobilized the culinary triangle to argue that paying attention to rot allows us to consider that the chef may not always be human. In this sense, rotting makes space for interpreting what is experienced as unplanned, unexpected, accidental, or even metaphysical. Non-human chefs, for instance, like yeast, transform rotting fruit or grain to become alcohol. In fermentation, the last gasps of plant lives are renewed by the respiration of microbial ones, creating a heady brew, sometimes accepted as the blood of Jesus, sometimes used to clean wounds. Things are rotten everywhere, and that's a good thing because there's no dying or living without rot.
That's great. One of the keywords that was in the back of my head as you were telling us about Rod is Deborah Bird Rose's notion of double death. She talks about
Mm.
first here in Australia how poisoning campaigns targeting dingoes don't just result in the death of the unwanted animal, but result in these cascading chains of death that are about deaths of communities. Tom Van Doren has explored similar things with vultures in India, and it seems like rot is this somewhat mysterious thing, this thing that's slightly beyond. Our contemporary science's ability to sort of grapple with the productive processes that channel death back into life. And yeah, thinking of it in the idiom of Isabel Stenger's, rot is often confined to this cosmopolitical beyond. We've got tools for grappling with limited worlds, and rot is this process that is often outside of our ability to know. Like if you look up compost in the dictionary of soils, you find that really the scientists don't know what is actually going on. It's sort of this laissez-faire approach to processes that are outside of our ability to control or guide. And I think some people are guiding these approaches, and yeah, maybe I'd love to hear more about if you've found people. You talked about beer and channeling the lively nature of these chefs. I'd just love to hear more examples of people and rotting microbes learning to get along together.
Yeah, well, maybe one of the ways to think about how I'm trying to think about rot and use it productively as an analytic frame is in other work that I do. I spend a lot of time looking at processes of preservation, how people are trying to stave off rot and decay, and that's really led me to be interested in what do we actually know about rot. Like, we're so fixated on trying to avoid it. Have biologists and life scientists and anthropologists actually studied rot as a kind of, or decay or breakdown as a normal process of life, not some kind of pathologized phenomenon to be avoided or pushed away. And I think that it's made me think in the biopolitics literature. There is so much attention to life, the politics of life itself, and I have become really interested in trying to get a different kind of traction on that. And it seemed like the way to go was to think about, where life is seen to be coming to an end, or where life continues in places that don't get included in our analytic frames of life. So I think there are lots and lots of examples of when you start thinking about microbial worlds in particular, which is always where my mind goes, then you have to understand rot. It's impossible to understand rot biologically without a multi-species framework, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. If you have a purely mechanistic view, then you miss a lot of what actually facilitates breakdown. And what's exciting there is then you can see that breakdown is never truly breakdown. Rot is never the absence of life. It's different kinds of life get to be privileged, which is why I got to thinking about doing ontology in reverse. And then I thought, well, is it deontology? But it's not deontology. It's a different kind of ontological frame that got me thinking, and this isn't about microbes, but it's actually about colonialism. If you think about one of the links I put on the essay here was this fantastic blog post by Zoe Todd on this provocation in response to Latour. Is ontology another word for colonialism? And I thought that was really fascinating in ways, I guess, that hark back to also to Debbie Rose in thinking about indigenous epistemologies and different ways of understanding what gets to count as a unit of analysis, a category for being. So in her idea of double death, that's a way of, like, through breakdown or rot, things kind of also can bioaccumulate and sort of build up. And how can we think about microbes and tracing that? An example that actually here I'm drawing from a science fair project I did when I was in 3rd grade, but why not? Do with that's actually, I think, timely in some ways with bioremediation. So using microbes as a way to break down oil, and so this was in response. Now you know how old I am. Exxon Valdez oil spill had just happened, and I was really interested in thinking about, well, how are we going to solve this problem? What are we going to do? And this was a time when people were experimenting with all different kinds of solutions to thinking about these problems. So using microbes as a way to break down not other forms of life, but things that threatened life. So oil was something that needed to be decomposed. So that's one kind of example I think that feeds into these kinds of animacies or not material life, non-life hybrids that we see in our multi-species world.
To play with another keyword of this conversation, becoming, I see a lot of stuff in the literature that's sort of about positive becomings, like, becoming with others in the world. And then there's sort of the Deleuze and Guattari becoming animal, which has this atavistic desire, I think, in my mind, misguided sense that we can sort of access some sort of animal id. But for me, it seems like rot might be thought of as an unbecoming, sort of one state of existence, and maybe like this teleology of good or bad, or it's this multiplicitous unbecoming. I mean, it's not like any sort of unidirectional thing, like the human becoming animal, and this sort of teleology oriented towards the past, or sort of this necessarily positive becoming that engenders like new ways of living together in the world. It's like ethics kind of fall apart with these sorts of becomings, and teleologies fall apart. Wondering what you
That's
thought of that.
really, that's really nice, and I think that's what attracted me to rot is a both as a phenomenon to observe in the world, but also as a way of reconstituting the kinds of collectivities that are going to be sustaining, and not in a kind of straightforward, like, mechanistic way, but in a affective, relational way. So it's very, I think about this in terms of ecology, aware that ecology has its own baggage and history, which has been one of my critiques and concerns about some of the Anthropocene thinking that people like Latour are promoting in his Inquiry to Modes of Existence, because at the same time that I agree that there are institutions that are worth saving, I question the sort of underlying assumption about the role of the human, and there's a weird sort of humanism to this the Anthropocene project, and I think rot allows us to really have a different way into a kind of process ontology, and to think about different ways of figuring out what are the modes of existence. And I think probably this is where Latour would say, oh, okay, great, give me a new mode of existence and follow it through, and we'll throw it in the website. So maybe rot. So I had an opportunity to sit on a panel with him, and I sort of proposed extinction as a mode of existence, like existing without existing. And so that's a certain kind of like life after life, or life after death, or something like that. So becoming, I agree with you, Evan, in trying to think about becoming as something that is radically other in its multiplicity, that that becoming isn't something singular, that like one entity becomes one other kind of entity, but that we could really sort of dissolve and reconstitute, or we could reconstitute entities without even having to change, just by respecifying where we look to identify meaningful, socially and naturally and culturally meaningful processes.
Yeah, against Latour's project, for me, rot is a productive way of thinking about a keyword of actor network theory, interessement. This idea that networks are assembled, in his model, usually by human entrepreneurs. It's sort of an exceptionalist view of networks, that we're the only agents able to do the interessement. Other agents exist, but we're the ones who do the entrepreneurial work to bring them together into networks. I mean, elsewhere I've sort of looked at other agents of interessement, but I think with rot, what we see are processes outside of the human ability to enlist agents sometimes. So, there are examples like beer and yeast. We can see this brew with particular microbes that we like, but in a compost pile, what you've got instead of interessement, it's more this laissez-faire, hands-off, like we have no idea if it's actinomycetes or bacteria or filamentous fungi doing this generative work. But it's sort of the space of what I call generative disinterest that allows for that multi-species flourishing.
Yeah, I think when you're sort of looking to the compost pile, and I think an even more perhaps provocative example would be the stomach, right? Like you've got like the compost pile that winds up in our stomach, and all of the microbial, world and whatever else has to go in there to break things down. So there's the stuff that's in the food that we eat, but there's also the denizens of our own gut, and this idea that the bacteria that are in one little crevice are not the same as the bacteria that are in another little crevice. And I could eat yogurt of certain kind of live cultures and make certain things happen. And so for me, this is maybe the ultimate radical dehumanization, is that you take a human body and you sort of show the way in which it's its own, not just one world, but it's a cosmos. And I think thinking about rot in that way, as a fundamental dimension of metabolism, but also as a kind of part of the life course, is really interesting to me. And when you were talking before about becoming, I was also thinking about like von Uexküll's idea of the Umwelt and the different kinds of temporalities and time scales and sort of worlds that the tick has, and that the deer has, and that the person has. And if you start including the sort of Lyme disease that like lives in the tick, and all of these other phenomena, then you can kind of unpack universes amongst us. Like I might say something like, we are each our own galaxy or something like that. And I think that's really radical and something that I'm excited to see lots of different people in different corners picking up and playing with.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to do a keyword on Umwelt. I think, and at the same time, this is getting away from rot, but at the same time,
you're never getting away from rot. You can't. The conversation is decomposing into something else. That's great.
So at the same time, we've got these phenomenologically bounded bubbles, right? If you want to use Sloterdijk interpretation of the Umwelt. Part of what's going on is the shared world and these bubbles grappling with each other. So it's those spaces of necessary sharing, to invoke the work of Beth Carruthers, who was on here recently, that I think are interesting. And maybe rot is this idea that shows us that the spaces of necessary sharing are often so expansive that, like our own limited Umwelt, we can't perceive what's in our gut, much less, these complicated chains of networks of life and death that we're moving through. So we've got rot in us. We're these walking sacks of rot, sort of how, as you were talking. That's we're tubes within a tube. Like that's the basic chordate body plan. If you go back to Amphioxus, this tiny little protochordate, that's our basic body plan. We're tubes within tubes, and we have rot within us, and then we're also entangled in these industrial and agro-ecological systems that are also premised on rot. So thank you for giving us a keyword for grappling with that.
No, it was my pleasure. It's been really fun to think about, and this has been absolutely the right forum to begin entertaining those ideas.
Awesome. And just another question. So I remember finding Sandor Katz's wild fermentation. And I was just thinking about what you were saying before about having kind of this universe going on inside. And it was at a time, I read Wild Fermentation at a time when I wasn't hanging out with, well, not obviously, with any other critters. And so I really took to like eating weird fermented foods and then thinking about, you know, who might be living inside me, and well, creepy, but really fun. And so I know that Sandor Katz's community, and I think he's in a queer community in Tennessee doing cool fermentation-y things. I was just wondering, are there any other rot communities around that are kind of embracing the mystery and wonder that is?
Well, not exactly in the way that you're pointing to, although I'm sure there are. I should say I haven't necessarily found them yet, but there are communities like that within our own academic circles. I have a colleague at University of Pennsylvania named Prajit Mukherjee who's been jokingly, and I'm just calling him out now, jokingly but semi-seriously arguing for a kind of shit studies, which would, you know, really be, and I think there's starting to be some real interest in it. So he put together a panel at the History of Science Society meeting this year with people looking at various dimensions of this sort of social uses of what we might call, in more polite terms, night soil. You know, I really like shit studies, and I'm sure it would be very to come up with a nice justification for what those words, social history of intestinal something.
Actually, there is a book. It's the history. I think it's the history of shit. I just purchased it. I haven't read it yet.
So I think there's definitely this is a nascent interest, and I'm excited to see what people are doing in history of medicine. Think about like fecal transplants is a very just direct example of, it's not quite fermentation studies, but this is about like shit sharing and becoming, you know, microbially kindred through, you know, sharing your microbiome or a particular dimension of your microbiome for purposes of digestion. And I think there's some really interesting questions to be asked there. But I'm sure that if I set my mind to it, if we all set our minds to it, we could come up with lots of other kinds of communities, and definitely be worth asking Heather Paxson about this.
Yeah, so Heather's already offered us microbiopolitics as one of our keywords, and she's got a great section in the Multi-Species Salon book about that, and a lot of the artists, everyone from Miriam Simon, who has human cheese, to Caitlin Berggren, who makes cycles of matter and meaning that are microbiopolitical in the sense of subverting dominant regimes of biopolitics. So she basically shares blood with a plant, the dandelion, that gives her medicine for an illness, hepatitis C. So yeah, Paxson's stuff on microbiopolitics is very key to this project, and very kindred to rot. So thank you so much for sharing 2 words with us in 2 days, cryopolitics and rot, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in the near future.
Sounds great.
Cool, thank you so much.